composition, essentially, it's an alternative to inheritance. So essentially, the idea is that you want to compose a given class A with other classes B, C, D, and so on. But the key thing to note here is that these additional classes B, C, D, and so on, they can't actually exist independently. So they can't exist without A actually, using them. So, it'll make more sense with an example. And the example we have is, one of a house and a room. So imagine you have a house class, and this house has this state variable or this class member referred to as rooms, and this rooms is just an array of room objects. And this room, the room class is just has a room number int. But what's happening here is that the house is composed of many different rooms. And what's important to note here is that the room class can't actually ever exist without this house class. It doesn't really make sense to have a room independently by itself. The room needs to be part of the house. So that's the key thing to notice here. You're composing a class of other classes or multiple instances of the same class, and then the class that you're composing from, that can't really exist by itself. So in this case, the room can't exist by itself. And again, notice that there's no inheritance happening here. So this doesn't mean that room is extending house or house is extending room. It just means that house has an instance of room or multiple instances, and room can't exist without it. Now, aggregation is very similar, with some small differences. So in the case of aggregation, the idea is that a class A, it has an instance of another class B or multiple classes, B, C, D, and so on. But the idea is that these other classes that A has an instance of, they can actually exist independently. So they can exist without A. So unlike composition, where the room couldn't exist without the house, in the case of aggregation, the room can exist without a house. And let's not use that example. Let's use this example of a shirt with text and a plain shirt. So the idea is that the shirt with text is composed of a plain shirt with some additional things added. So we have this plain shirt, and then the shirt with text has an instance of that plain shirt, but it adds some additional things like it'll add a logo, it'll add a text, and then maybe it'll have a different price. But the takeaway here is that the plain shirt can indeed exist without the shirt with text class. So we don't necessarily ever need to instantiate the shirt with text class for the plain shirt to sort of exist. You can have just the plain shirt by itself, and you can play around with that object, and then the shirt with text adds additional things on top of the plain shirt, and again, the plain shirt can exist without it. So that's the difference between aggregation and composition. So to recap, in composition you have a class that's composed of other classes, and these other classes, they can't exist without A, they can't exist independently. And in aggregation, it's the same idea. You have a class that's composed of other classes, but these other classes, they can exist independently.